right, thank you so much for making time and for joining us on yet another edition of what is about to become your favorite Pan-African talk show, Africa 411. My name, as always, is Eugene, and Nangwe, our sign language interpreter, is Ann Wairimo. Now, on the program tonight, we'll be focusing on the media in the continent. Of course, we'll be asking ourselves some pertinent questions, whether the media is crippled, especially during these times of COVID-19. How much has the media worked as far as performing its advocacy role and, of course, the watchdog role in keeping the government and those in power to check on the handling of this particular pandemic? This is what we'll be asking ourselves on this particular program. So we want you to get conversational with us. All you need to do is tweet us and add the hashtag Africa411. Now, we'll be able to join our panelists on the program, who's none other than John Allen Namu, the CEO Africa Uncensored. Of course, we'll also be joined by Fifi Peters, who's an anchor with CNBC Africa, and Patrick Gadara, who's a strategic communications consultant and also a journalist. Now, before we get into that, let's take a look at the top stories tonight. And of course, we start off with a look at what's happening on the coronavirus pandemic. And 17 more people have actually tested positive for the coronavirus in the country, raising the country's total number of confirmed cases to 320. This even as the port city of Mombasa comes under sharp focus due to a surge in COVID-19 numbers. Tony Murigi has the details.
From the samples collected today, we have 17 persons who have tested positive for coronavirus disease. This therefore brings the total of confirmed cases in the country to 320 cases.
As Kenya's confirmed coronavirus cases rises, the Ministry of Health is raising concern over local transmission of the virus at a community level. 15 out of the new infections reported today were through contact tracing. The port city of Mombasa has come under a sharp focus following an increase in the number of new coronavirus cases. Despite a partial lockdown, Mombasa County accounted for 12 of today's new cases, this raising a red alert of the spread of the virus in the county.
All the 7 are Kenyans, 12 from Mombasa, 5 from all the 17 are Kenyans, 12 from Mombasa, 5 from Nairobi.
From the ever-busy Likoni ferry to the populated Kongowea market, the human-to-human daily interaction in Mombasa could be a danger lurking in darkness. Residents casting doubts on the Ministry of Health guidelines.
Wengine wetu ni vijana tunatafuta ajira, lakini tunapitia kwa hii biashara ili tuweze kujikimu maisha. Lakini swala hili limekuwa gumu sana kutokana na hii hali ya corona ambayo imetokea katika maisha yetu.
The ministry has urged Kenyans to uphold the government's guidelines in combating the virus, the basic ones being social distancing and maintaining high standards of hygiene.
We continue with this fight. We have also observed that some public service vehicles are defying our containment measures. And increasingly, we are sliding back to the old ways of conducting business. We would like to remind Kenyans that action shall be taken against anyone known to be flouting the current containment measures in place.
While launching a coronavirus treatment center, Mombasa Governor Ali Hassan Joho urged residents of the county to work with county to curb the spread of the virus.
So that we are doing our best to ensure we have facilities that are adequate to look after you. But you also must help us when you get symptoms or when you realize you've contacted someone that has symptoms or even tested positive or around people that have been found to be positive. The right thing for you to do is to come forward, and we here are ready to help. We will continue to help. This facility.
Aaron Kipkoech, TV47.
Elsewhere, 2 more bodies have been recovered in Chesogon area, which is between Elgeyo Marakwet and West Pokot counties, bringing the death toll to 17. following flash floods 6 days ago. Now, in Kisumu, rice farmers have actually lost close to R1 billion after floods destroyed their rice fields. Here's Daniel Debede with the details.
Rift Valley Regional Coordinator George Natembeya has said that rescue effort in Chesogon, West Pokot County may be called off due to heavy rains pounding the area. This is even after 2 more bodies were recovered, bringing the death toll to 17. 20 people are still not accounted for since Saturday when flash floods and landslide hit Chesogon town that lies at the border of West Pokot and Elgeyo Marakwet counties. Elsewhere, thousands of rice farmers in Ahero and Kano in Kisumu County are counting losses after floods swept away their crops.
Tulipata shida kwa mchele, tuliweka mbegu, maji ikaenda nayo yote. Yenye walipanda maji ikaenda nayo yote. Sasa tuko na shida, hasara tena tuko nayo hapa.
Sio mchele hiyo narubika, maji narubika kabisa.
Tumeweka mbegu kwa shamba. Unaweza ona pale kuna maji imeharibu mbegu kwa shamba. Shamba yote imeharibika. Ukienda huko block P, block D kule juu imeharibu kila kitu. Juzi tumeweka fertilizer kwa shamba. Sasa hii maji imeenda sweep away fertilizer yote. Sasa tunaomba serikali hapa kwanza wapate permanent solution ya hao watu.
The National Irrigation Board West Kano manager Joel Tanui says that more than 7,500 acres of rice fields were destroyed, adding that farmers have lost over 800 million shillings.
For the last 3 days, we've experienced massive flooding in both Nyando and Moroni sub-counties that covers the rice belt in the region. We always have more than 11,000 acres of rice, and as we speak, we have lost 7,500 acres into the flood damage. This covers Ahero, Southwest Kano, and West Kano irrigation schemes. This means the farmer has lost slightly over 800 million in terms of revenue. That is what the farmer was expecting to harvest this season.
The farmers are having great problems. We are going to lose in Ahero if you take 2,168 acres times 30 bags per acre. That means over 7,000 tons are going to waste.
However, Kisumu County government has begun relief for distributing exercise to the affected families. More than 32,000 people have been evacuated to safe zone in both Kano and Ahero areas.
In the past 48 hours, the Departments of Social Programs, Agriculture and Water have managed to evacuate about 32,000 persons to various identified evacuation centers.
Daniel Dembede, TV47, Kisumu County.
Right, of course, those were some of our top stories coming in at this particular hour. Of course, we'll keep you posted when we get further details on this and other stories. Now, let's get to our discussion for tonight. We'll be asking ourselves whether the media in Africa has actually played its role in keeping authorities in check in their handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. Before the conversation, actually, we've been receiving several tweets throughout the day. Let's take a look at some of those particular comments that have been coming in from various quarters across the continent. Let's take a look at one of those particular tweets that came in from some of those who have been tweeting us. Of course, once it comes on the screen, we'll definitely be able to read it for you. But of course, we want to encourage you to tweet us. All you need to do is add the hashtag Africa411. There you go. Brian Kosgei at Kosgei Brian says media is insensitization has been key, and we applaud members of the Fourth Estate for their efforts. Thank you so much for that particular tweet. We've definitely been able to receive several of them. Another one here from Jackson Wambugu, which says local media itself is on its deathbed. We always forget to check ourselves. Let's take a look at another tweet, which definitely comes from Tom Rasto, who says yes, and to some extent no. There has been cases, tool updates, regulations to be followed, and a COVID-19 pandemic, and raise voices to these, and of course those who are unable to afford cost of living due to the total lockdown. I think you're saying we need to be able to expose some of those particular issues that are facing those who are going through these difficulties. Media censorship is a major obstacle. This is Joash Onsare who says this, and of course we want to look at the last one here. I don't think it was or been crippled. However, it has redefined the way business should be done. Like in any other sector, the norm on how we've been conducting business is through accountable questioning. We are continuing to levy or to look at ways that actually aren't working. Thank you very much for those tweets. We want to encourage you to keep them coming. Let me bring in our panelists on this particular conversation tonight. We have John Allan Namu, who is actually the CEO of Africa Uncensored. Also with us tonight is Fifi Peters, our former colleague at CNBC Africa. Great to see you, Fifi.
Great to see you too, Eugene.
Also with us is Patrick Gadara, who's actually a strategic communications consultant, but also a journalist. He's been able to do his trade through satire or cartoons. Thank you so much, Gadara, for joining us on the program.
Thanks for having me.
Great. I'm going to start with you, actually, Gadara. In 2014, you actually penned an article on The Guardian, and actually it was titled, "If Western Journalists Get Africa Wrong, Who Gets It Right?" And of course, the opening of this particular article went like this, and I'll quote, "There's been much criticism of the way the West covers the continent, but are African journalists doing a better job?" asks Patrick Gadara. Today, I want to toss that question over to you and ask you the same question. Do you think African journalists are doing a better job?
Well, I think we have to distinguish what we mean. Obviously, when we're talking about the West covering Africa, we're thinking of the West as an entity covering Africa as an entity. Mm-hmm. Now, if you take African journalists in that sense, that do they cover the entire continent well, then I would have to say I don't think they do a better job than the Western institutions, simply because lots of them, for example, journalists in Kenya, don't have the resources to cover Nigeria. They're not going to be traveling up and down. They don't have the money to do it. Don't have the opportunities and the resources to do it. But you could ask the question in a different way. Do Kenyan journalists, for example, cover Kenya well? And I think that then becomes a bit nuanced there, because I think in general, Kenyan journalists are good at reporting the news. What they're not really good at is at explaining it. So they will definitely tell you what the government said yesterday. Mm-hmm. What that means, whether it's important that government said it or what was missed out, I think they are less well-equipped or less able to tell that. So therefore, news and politics ends up becoming very almost like a soap opera. It's all mostly entertainment, and it's most of the time it's not really related to how people live day to day, and it doesn't give them information that they can then utilize in their everyday lives, either to hold people to account or to improve how they go.
Right. So for the purpose of this debate tonight, you stand on the side that actually agrees that the media in Africa, and specifically in Kenya, from your explanation on where you see the gaps, there's a crippling aspect in that sense. Is this where you stand?
Yes, I think there's a real deficit in how it's covered. I think we'll see as this discussion evolves, we'll be able to highlight some of it. I think even in the case of the coronavirus coverage, and there has been quite a lot of gaps. I mean, just one quick example is what you guys have just reported. We keep getting this announcement about confirmed numbers, confirmed cases.
Yes.
But nobody really explains, what does that actually mean? Does this mean that Kenya has 320 cases of coronavirus in the entire country? Probably not. This is just what it has confirmed. So why is that number important? Nobody really explains that. They just keep repeating it because government is announcing it. And I think that's one of the big problems we have.
Right, we'll be actually investigating or probing that in detail. Let me bring in John Allen Namu. John, you better part of your career, you've spent it as an investigative journalist. Of course, Gadara says, or actually asks, that we actually have to distinguish. Are we talking about covering specific African countries? If that's the case, then in Kenya, we've actually seen a failure in that particular aspect. But from where you sit, Alan, where do you see the gap? Because at the end of the day, the way Africa is portrayed in many cases has been in a negative light, and this, we've always said, is what the Western media does about Africa. You have done investigative stories of which have exposed some ills within Africa. How do you distinguish or draw the line between being seen as one of those people who are creating Afro-pessimism and being a person who's still also pushing for good deeds in Africa so that people are optimistic about the continent?
Well, I think the definition of investigative journalism as Afro-pessimistic on one hand, or pushing for good deeds on the other, it deserves a bit more nuance. Mm-hmm. For one, I think the first duty of any journalist, whether you want to label it as patriotic or not, is to tell the truth about the country in which they're reporting. And that's essentially what investigative journalism does. Now, to your question about whether African journalists are covering the continent better than Western journalists, I'd agree with Gavara that it's a function of, for quite a bit of it is a function of finances. And the other bit, to be honest, is training and leeway in a sense. So there's a couple of things that stand in the way of really good reporting. Although I have to say, within the context of COVID-19, there have been pockets of really, really good journalism that have come out of Kenya, that have come out of different parts of Africa. And in a sense, and I wrote this as part of an editorial, that seems to be a reawakening of the actual spirit of journalism, which is to go look for context, go explain context, go seek experts, go seek the right answers and explain it to the public. The dearth that Gavara that was referring to in terms of quality really stems from there. I couldn't agree more, to be honest. I mean, Gavara really put it well, right, that we report the news, we explain it. We kind of mistake balance for false equivalence. So you have politician A on one hand, politician B on the other, and then we call it a balanced story. So right, those are some of the issues that I've seen, not just in Kenya but across the continent.
Right, and that now takes me to South Africa. Fifi, the World Health Organization actually a couple of hours ago commended South Africa on its management of COVID-19. Of course, the executive director actually said that the country has done an impressive job in bringing the spread of the virus under control. First of all, as a person who's been on the ground, of course, also reporting or talking about coronavirus, do you agree? And number two, how different has the South African media, or what role has the South African media played in this success, depending on the answer that you give us?
First of all, I'd like to agree with my fellow panelists. I agree entirely that as we are constrained in telling the African narrative by finances, and we are also constrained by skill, and also what was highlighted by the freedom to be able to tell the story truthfully and wholly. But we'll come back to those points, I imagine, later on in the discussion. In fact, Eugene, during your news bulletin, I was listening to the number of confirmed cases there in Kenya, around 320 or so, and that is the number that we have just increased by. We've increased by, according to our latest statistics, 318 new confirmed COVID-19 cases, bringing our total to 3,953. We are the largest on the continent in terms of the hits from the coronavirus. But I agree with your initial statement when you speak about what the WHO did say about how South Africa had handled the COVID-19 spread. So on March 23rd, we enacted a national lockdown where essentially we shut down the entire economy. Every single province in our country was locked down. People were not allowed to go anywhere. People were not even allowed to walk their dogs or jog or buy cigarettes or even alcohol. Those are some of the things that were deemed non-essential. And initially, when that happened, there was criticism from the Western media or some Western media about how draconian our President Cyril Ramaphosa had been in acting against the spread of the coronavirus. In fact, there was a particular media house that described it as very similar to the oppressive apartheid regime that we're coming from pre-1994. And what was interesting about that is that local media actually stood up to that to say, firstly, the two are incomparable. You cannot compare a lockdown or a situation where people are being told to stay indoors for their health to a situation whereby people were previously locked out of the economy as a result of force by the then oppressive white rule. And another criticism that came out quite strongly in local media was the fact that South Africa has the highest incidences of HIV, of TB than anywhere in the world, or amongst the highest. And the thing is that these are people whose immune systems are vulnerable. And we've been hearing that the coronavirus, if we take it to that example, the coronavirus tends to strike hardest on these people with vulnerable immune systems. And therefore, what highlighted was the system or the actions by our government to enforce a very draconian lockdown was in actual fact the best thing for the citizens. And this is why right now we are making big efforts in flattening the curve. Although the past couple of days our numbers have been increasing quite significantly over the average 90-day mark that our health minister had say would determine whether South Africa's lockdown would be extended once again, which is quite worrying. In fact, right now in around 15 minutes or so, our president is expected to deliver an address to the nation on how he plans to reopen the economy, if he does, in fact. But for me, that example actually just does point out to the fact that in incidences where Western media perhaps is a bit exaggerated in their storytelling, or perhaps doesn't tell the picture fully, there are cases where local media does rise up, not out of patriotism, but out of fact. It's a fact that the apartheid system can't be compared to the lockdowns instituted everywhere in the world. It is a fact that those with weaker immune systems are more vulnerable to suffering loss of life as a result of the coronavirus. But for me, I agree 100% with what the panelists have said so far, in the sense that our job as journalists is to tell the facts, and the facts will dictate whether the story is positive or whether the story is negative. Can we do more to advance the narrative around the continent and tell the continent story fully? Of course. I mean, there's always room for improvement, but I'll just leave it at there for now.
Right. Well, you're still at it. We've already heard from Gadara, who actually said that a majority of the reporting, or actually the stories coming out of Kenyan media as far as COVID-19 is concerned, is seen more to do with just a focus on the numbers and then leaving it at that. Tell me about how different you feel the media in South Africa is actually handling this. How easy is it for you to actually go beyond just these numbers and digging deeper for more analysis and explaining to the citizens what these numbers even mean and what these announcements even mean?
All right. I must say that, first of all, the coronavirus and this COVID-19, the specific case of coronavirus, it's a new experience for everyone, for health practitioners, for business leaders, for governments, even for us as journalists in our reporting. And at the initial stages, obviously, everybody was concentrated on specifically those numbers and the number of people that were being infected and the number of people that were dying. And in fact, even our government, when they were reporting the numbers quite regularly, they report actually focusing on those two. But the fantastic thing about this is because it's so new and it's also so serious, there's a lot of people that don't want to make a mistake, because ultimately lives are at stake here. And what our government has been very forthcoming in doing is opening themselves up to questioning. I remember in the early days, well, even before around exactly how to do things properly for the best interests of our people. Ever since we were locked down on the 23rd of March, Eugene, I can tell you every other day there is a briefing of some sort from some government cluster regarding the latest updates with the coronavirus, the impacts on the economy, what is being done to secure supplies, what is being done to address the concerns of the most vulnerable. And those briefings have sometimes gone on for a very long time as a result of question and answer sessions. As I said, this is new ground for a lot of us. Right. Even our health journalists who have covered previous cases before, I believe there was some who covered the 2013 SARS outbreak. Yeah. A lot of the information right now that is coming out from the coronavirus is new. So I do believe that our my fellow colleagues here in South Africa are really doing their best to go beyond the numbers and ask the questions and really extract the information to the point whereby government has now even started reporting on the number of recoveries in some cases. But of course, this number is not emphasized too much so as not to give people the impression that, the coronavirus is not that serious, you can recover from it, we can go business as usual. But there's certainly efforts to go beyond just the numbers that are given by government.
There is effort to go beyond the numbers. Let me come back to Gadara again, because Fifi says that the ASA government has been open to questioning as far as coronavirus is concerned. Come back to our situation here in Kenya. Of course, we've been seeing the Ministry of Health and sometimes even the President himself making these addresses to the public as far as the status of coronavirus pandemic is concerned here in Kenya. Gadara, what sort of questions do you feel the media has failed to ask during this session? Because we can't say that the government has not been open to questioning, because these press conferences, we've seen media actually reporting or covering this live. What questions do you feel have not been asked when this opportunity has actually availed itself?
First, I've got to say our government is not anywhere near as open as the South African.
Yes.
Our press conference, our briefings, if you see them, they'll come, they'll speak for about half an hour or something like that, and then they'll take 2 questions or 3 questions and then walk away. So it's not a real engagement. So in a sense, you could argue that our media doesn't actually get the opportunity to. But still, there are follow-up sessions. I'm sure, they can call up after. It's not the opportunity to speak to government is not only restricted to the briefing. So there should be other opportunities that they can take up. As to what they should be asking about, I think for me, the more important thing is to explain to people what is happening. What is going on, So it's safe, I think, as panelists say, it's safe for people to report numbers, because governments say 320 people, we report 320, we are fine, But to explain what that 320 means, I think it's a bit harder to go beyond question, why particular things are being, or particular actions are being taken by government as opposed to others. What are the options to actually allow a society to have a debate, a discussion? I think if you go online and look at what's happening on social media, it's really instructive of what should be happening on our mainstream press. It's almost as if the debates that should be done, they have been displaced. So online you've got people engaging with epidemiologists, asking them questions about these very numbers. You've got even journalists who are going and reporting about what's happening, for example, in our slums, etc., and then putting that stuff out on Twitter, not really online. In their newspaper pages, as if it's not welcome. And I think that there's, to me, a real sense that our media is missing an opportunity to actually mediate a discussion.
Right.
And it's giving it up in favor of simply reporting, and you keep seeing it's privileging the sort of what I call official truth, the official discourse, what government says. Everything has to be officially verified. It hasn't happened till government says it has. But government keeps lying to them, and in many instances. I mean, the other day, they were all reporting about this supposed fake funeral that was going to happen in Homa Bay. Turns out not to have been a fake one, but it was government, again, that was declaring it this way. There is no questioning of that official narrative. And I think for me, and this has been something that's not just brought on by coronavirus, it's been a trend that's been going on for quite a long time, I would say for the better part of 20 years, where we privilege what the officialdom says rather than question it and put it to task and get them to explain what it means.
Great. And Alan, I'm going to bring you also on this, because at the end of the day, I want to know your position on this. Do you also agree that probably the lack of openness to questioning by our governments, and of course, sometimes they've said in our nature as Africans, we like being secretive, being private. Even when a leader is sick, most of the time we often don't even get to know that they are sick, because it is seen as a taboo to be able to share such kind of information. And if indeed it's true that our governments are not open to give us this information, then what does the media do? Do we fold our hands and just sit at a corner and cry over it? What should we be doing to ensure that this information that Gadara says we need to be seeing out here, also the mediating process, is actually happening in real sense?
Exactly the opposite of folding up our hands and sort of, throwing them up and giving up. This is exactly the time that we need to be going out and seeking the answers that the public deserves. The government might posture itself as the official source of truth, single source of truth. But there are people out of government circles, or even people within government circles, who are willing to sit down and explain and express just what is happening in the country, in the region, on the continent, and across the globe with regard to the novel coronavirus. This novel coronavirus, as Fifi said, it's new to everybody, and the only way for a government to be able to explain and express, and as well as keep temperatures calm with regard to this new situation that we're all facing, is honesty. But governments that have been opaque, governments that are used to not giving the full, sort of spread of truth, will always react in this way. So it is habit. It is out of habit that governments such as our own react in the way that they do, where they would only, put up this performance of a press conference, as opposed to actually opening themselves up to questions, not just from journalists, but also to the public. This is the time to communicate. This is the time to express that perhaps they don't have all of the answers. And if they don't have the answers, this is, this is the channel that they're going to take to find those answers. And there are examples across the world of governments that have communicated effectively and efficiently, and the impact that has had on this virus. We're all handling it at the same time, and yet there are governments that are able to handle it better. It's not for lack of intelligence. It is out of habit that we continually see these kinds of things. And, I have to say, sitting on the side of journalists, I am also a bit disappointed that envelope is not being pushed. There are so many things that we need to be talking about. For instance, when a settle-in-place order is put in place, such as the ones that we've seen across the continent, what impact does it have on a society such as ours that has 80% of its population working informally? What does it mean for you to be under curfew when you live hand to mouth? There have been attempts to answer these questions by some journalists on the mainstream, I have to admit. But you need to go further than that. How have food delivery systems broken down, or how have they been impacted? And what's the long-term view with regard to this? We were already food stressed before COVID-19 came around, knocking on our doors. What does it mean now? There's so many things that need to be asked, and I think we ought to do a better job.
But more often than not, just a bit, Gadara, and as you come in...
Just very quickly.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that with regard to what Jonathan has said, I think it's important that we don't just limit it to reporting what is happening, but to actually putting in front of people what their options are. This is something that is facing the whole of society, not just decisions to be made by government. It is decisions to be made by society. And so when people are talking about options such as locking down our societies, what else is there? Is this the only thing we can do? And then we can start thinking and bringing on other experts who can say, well, perhaps we could look at South Korea, who didn't have to lock down, and say, what did they get right? And is there something we can learn from there? Rather than simply be railroaded into this discussion by government that says there's only one way of tackling this, and this is how it's got to do.
Right. Very interesting thoughts coming through. But of course, I'm sure there's so many people who feel that this is the time for the fourth estate to actually also play a role in offering guidance and also influencing probably some of the policies that are being designed in those boardrooms when these government officials meet to decide on what to do next during the next press briefings. But then how much are we pushing as a unit for our thoughts to be felt? Because these amazing ideas that we're sharing on this particular platform right now, how much are we, or how far are we pushing them to ensure that they are actually taken up when government needs to make certain decisions, as we're saying?
Is that for me?
Yes, go ahead. Yes.
Right. Again, when we have these sorts of, I think we need to have much more of these sorts of discourses, of these sorts of discussions, because then hopefully they will be picked up, and in the areas where journalists interact with government and with other players, they go out and look for epidemiologists, who don't necessarily work for government, people who have different points of view. So that we start seeing this thing in its entirety, rather than simply the small picture that government provides us, And I think that by having these sorts of discussions, by programs such as yours and others, bringing to light and highlighting the gaps that are there, then people can actually start doing something about it. People can actually first recognize that they exist, whether it's people in the media who recognize that, look, our coverage is not the best. What else can we do? And I think within that, you can then start pushing these agendas. I don't for 1 minute ignore the fact that there are constraints on our media.
Yeah.
And the fact that our government really doesn't want to speak. They're very afraid of being criticized. I mean, it's one interesting thing you always find. It's almost a constant refrain during the press briefings, and they say, "Oh, we're really happy with your with the media performance, the media reporting, and please don't criticize us, etc." So they are really, really afraid. So they don't want to speak. But if we can find ways to push it, to talk to them, to ensure that we are actually putting to them questions that help the audience understand. Don't forget the media stands in the space of the audience.
Yes.
You're there to help people actually understand something, not simply to come out with a headline.
Yeah.
And I think that if we keep that in mind, then we can start doing a much better job of ensuring that our people can engage in the discussions about the things that affect them, about how their lives are going to be lived in the next few months and years.
Right. Fifi, before we go for the break, I want to bring you in on this one. John Allen Namu actually mentioned earlier that this is the time to go out there as journalists to actually look for this information and, borrowing from the words of Gadara, actually sit in and speak for the audiences or take that particular space on their behalf. But this is also the time when we are seeing most media houses reducing their numbers of journalists, adjusting the operations, many now working from their houses. We've gone into our houses and locked ourselves in there. How do we go out, as John Allen Namu says?
How do we go out and also observe social distancing laws that are there to essentially keep us safe from contracting the coronavirus? Eugene, that's the $1 million question, I suppose. But what has happened here in South Africa is that the media has been declared as an essential service. And the media has continued to go out to the briefings, to the communities that are affected by the coronavirus, to expose some of the things that are happening there, some of the great things that are happening there and also some things that can be done better. The media, in fact, has been on the streets, exposing some people who are not even observing the lockdown rules, and even companies that are not doing so. And those that can, those media houses that do have the resources to do so and to send out their journalists responsibly, have been doing so. Of course, my example or my experience has been a lot different. As a financial journalist, most companies are seen as non-essential and they have shut. And those that are even open have taken most of their work remotely. And the medium in which we communicate with these companies has been, first of all, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, our news service, where companies communicate the impact that COVID-19 is having on their business and the kind of action that they're taking as a result. And also, you might have seen a lot of our programming is done exactly like you're doing your programming, via Skype and via Zoom calls and via all kinds of social media platforms. So, I mean, Eugene, it is tough. It's not only tough for the media industry, it's tough for us all. And I think that this virus is really accelerating this push into this fourth industrial revolution and demanding that we find smarter and more efficient ways of doing our jobs. And this, it doesn't exclude us even as the media industry. But if you don't mind, how much time do we have before the break? Because I actually wanted to pick up on the question around policy and how some of our reporting is influencing policy.
Right, go ahead. Once you're done with that particular point, we'll take that particular break.
All right, I'll keep it very short because I do know as the media we still need to pay our bills and let the advertisers do their thing. But when the coronavirus first landed on particularly on global shores, what we did see is an unprecedented move of central bankers and finance ministers just pumping money into the global system, into their respective economies, to make sure that the economies had all the money that they needed to survive this, to make sure that the banks had the money that they needed to lend to distressed businesses. Interest rates were slashed to zero to put some form of money back into the pockets of consumers as a result of the economy grinding to a halt. And here in South Africa, we saw a similar thing. We did have an unprecedented 100 basis point interest rate cut at the time, which then economists had said that it was commendable because interest rates were slashed to record lows, but it was not enough. And this is a story that financial journalists continue to tell, that our Reserve Bank, which is seen as a bastion of our institutional strength, or one of the bastions of our institutional strengths, because of its independence and its refusal to be influenced by political forces. But it's also been criticized for being very conservative, and the 100 basis point cuts were seen as great but not good enough. As a result, fast forward a week or so ago, we had another interest rate cut coming from our Reserve Bank, 100 basis points, and this wasn't even announced. It came before a planned meeting. And we also had the Reserve Bank stepping into our bond market to buy secondary bonds to try and fuel the system there with liquidity. They lowered the capital ratios of banks to ensure that banks had more than enough money to lend to distressed businesses. And again, economists kept on saying that this was not enough, despite the fact that National Treasury has said that it's expected, the latest actions from the Reserve Bank are expected to inject some 60 to 70% back into our economy. The narrative was that it was not enough. Right now, South Africa has just announced a 500 billion rand stimulus plan to stimulate our economy. It's the health response to the COVID-19, but also the economic response as a result of the shutdown hampering on business. And one of the avenues that we're using to fund that is, like many African countries, go to a Western or multilateral institution to get help. Economists are saying that this move is expensive. They're also saying that the decision by our Treasury to want to come to market to increase their borrowing from the bond market is also expensive, and that there's cheaper ways to fund our recovery via printing money. So far, our Reserve Bank has spoken very strongly against South Africa's position of that kind of quantitative easing and printing money.
Fifi, and what have the journalists said? Because I'm hearing the financial experts, the economists, but how have the journalists or the media in South Africa, what role are they playing to actually either stop this or actually catalyze whatever decision is going to come out? Just very briefly.
But, very briefly, when it comes to finance, or I think that actually when it comes to any form of reporting, the media, we don't at any second try to pretend that we're the expert. As you said, we're merely the conduits to relay the message to the decision makers and the stakeholders. And that's why I emphasize that the media has been telling the story of the experts, the guys who are expected to know what they're doing when they crunch the numbers and know what they're saying when they say things like South Africa should, for instance, be printing money. We're hoping that they have done all the forecasts to really unpack the implications of this. Yeah. And so the media have been a conduit of this message. And suffice to say, like I say, before our Reserve Bank was described as being rather conservative in its approach to monetary policy, as a result of the continued reports from the financial think tanks and from the economists about the Reserve Bank being in a position to do more, we have from there. So I think to a large degree, there is a lot, government is listening to us, and there is some policy changes that is resulting as a result of the stories we're telling pertaining to the coronavirus right now.
All right. Great. Of course, we're going to take a very short break. Gadara, Alanamu, stay with us. Of course, we'll come back and we'll be asking ourselves whether the new media, that is social media, whether it has actually taken up the position or the major role of mainstream media. Have we surrendered our responsibility to new media, that is social media? Because we've seen a lot of the push coming from social media. And of course, even when it comes to videos of violations of, the rights of citizens, even during implementation of these curfews and lockdowns, a lot of the videos have come majorly from citizen journalists and pushed fast on social media before mainstream media picks that. We'll be able to dissect that and much more when we come back from the break. And of course, we'll be reading your tweets. Keep them coming. Remember to add the hashtag Africa411. Stay with us.
When it comes to pimple care, Acne's Creamy Wash contains multiple vitamins and removes excessive oil and dirt. Acne's Toner rejuvenates skin. Acne's Sealing Gel fights bacteria. Use Mentholatum Acne's for clear and smooth skin every day.
My name is Sujata Kotam Raju. I am the National General Secretary of Hindu Council of Kenya. Namaskar to my dear sisters and brothers. Now this is the time everyone will have to take the responsibility to fight against this virus, not to spread further in this country. If at all, if you want to go out, maintain the social distance. Avoid going to the enclosed areas like supermarket, temples, churches, any religious functions. Avoid shaking your hands and hugs, any form of physical contact. You can just say namaste. For more information, dial 719 or star 719 hash. Kamesha Corona.
Since late last year, the coronavirus COVID-19 has emerged as a serious healthcare threat. This is an infection that has gone global and no one has been spared. The government, through the Ministry of Health, has put in measures to keep Kenyans safe against COVID-19, which is currently rampant around the world, with new confirmed infections and death cases daily. Such sanitization and screening of visitors at these border posts and across every entry point in the country is very vital in preventing the spread of the disease in the country.
I'm very happy about the screenings that are going on in Tanzania and Kenya. I think it's very proactive that you're thinking about stopping it at the border so that it does not spread.
It is scary that a single cough here can lead to an outbreak of epic proportions. In order to prevent that, the government has instituted measures to keep Kenyans safe.
The facility has all the equipments you need, from handling a basic patient up to ICU setting.
However, you also have a role to play in preventing spread of infections.
Citizen responsibility is the key to the success of this initiative and these measures. Let's all do what we have to do individually. And this is how we are going to defeat this disease.
It's just our general hygiene, okay? And that now means at workplaces, we should ensure that our work surfaces are clean.
Let's ensure that tumefanya proper sanitation ya mikono. Every time na board matatu, lazima ni sanitize mikono.
We have faced many severe challenges as a nation, and we have always found a way to rise above them. COVID-19 is no different, and will overcome the pandemic. Stop coronavirus. Follow all directives from the Ministry of Health. Wash your hands properly.
Look at gesturing. It is on the same point of affirming. But in this case, on gesturing, this is where, as a teacher, you are working.
The second reason why entrepreneurship is important is also that it helps you to plan for business finance. Business finance here simply means how much money do you need at the point of starting the business, and when is it needed, and is it for a short period of time or for a long period of time?
We still feel that the tourists are not getting value for their money. That experiential experience they are looking for is not there.
All right, thank you so much for still being with us right here on Africa 4-1 on TV 47. Of course, we've been having a conversation on whether the media in Africa is crippled, especially during this COVID-19 period. This is a discussion on whether the media is playing its role in actually keeping authorities in check on their handling of COVID-19 pandemic. We have feedback that has been coming through via the hashtag Africa 4-1. Brian Okech says, I believe that we've seen lately in the media is promising. Journalists are going an extra mile to actually explain the news and telling the truth. We are actually doing okay in telling our story. We may not be there yet, but we are making progress. That's an optimistic tweet right there. Alexander Kimani says, African journalists are trying their best. Media in Africa is not crippled. There are challenges, but we are trying. We are covering the COVID-19 pandemic the way we can, and journalists should be congratulated on that particular note. Now, let me bring back our panelists, Jonal Namu, CEO Africa Uncensored, Fifi Peters, anchor CNBC Africa, and Patrick Kadara, a strategic communications consultant. Now, we've seen from the tweets that we have a couple of people who feel that there is a lot of good work going on in the media. But let's talk a bit about what happened just a few days ago, especially when it comes to the reporting on COVID-19 and the statements that the media has been making. There is a media house here in Kenya that actually had to, apologize several times on air for actually a caption that they put based on what they felt. I'm sure the editorial team and the teams that were behind that particular story, they felt was well fit for that particular story and how the president of that particular African country was handling COVID-19. So how do we as media still stand our ground, especially when we believe that what we are saying is the truth? Because going by the numbers of the cases of coronavirus that are being reported in that country, then probably that media house was right. Gadara.
Well, I know you're referring to Citizen, and
I did not mention any names. That is what you said.
I hope I won't put you in any problems. But the fact is, I think there are restrictions and there are problems that our media faces when it comes to reporting, and especially in this region, the example given is the more, I guess, regional one, you would say. But across the region, you'll find a similar cases where it's very hard for media to actually go out and report. In Kenya, for example, we've got now the cyber crimes law. People are being prosecuted for supposedly reporting falsehoods when it comes to COVID-19, So, and that just puts a chill on reporting. It's just a way of government sort of trying to corner the space to say that the only truth is what they tell us. I think in the case you've just mentioned, there is a problem also with the media itself, in the sense that there is no solidarity that is shown. So the station basically had to stand by itself. So the first time the same thing happened to the Nation, during Kwet's time when the East African was banned from Tanzania because of a cartoon by Gado. And again, nobody stood with the Nation. The rest of the media was quite happy to continue going. And I think it's really important for media to recognize that a threat to one of them is a threat to all. So that they all stand up and say that, look, we are not going to take it. You cannot treat one of us like this. And they make those governments pay a price for doing this. As it is now, governments are very, very easily able to pick them out, to pick them one by one, to go after them single cases, because they know that there is no solidarity within the media space itself. So I think that in as much as really we should all condemn what Tanzanian government did, etc., but also media needs to look at itself and to ask, why is it we are not all standing together against this? Why are we allowing them to pick us off one by one, rather than actually extracting a price every time they do this?
Right. Alan, I mean, I would love to read your thoughts on this. Is this going to be our undoing as a continent, as a profession, as a bloc? The competition that we usually have, making us not be able to stand up for each other in cases where we feel that one of us did the right thing, said the right thing, but is now facing punishment for whatever they did. Will this be our undoing? Is this why we are crippled in one way or another?
Sorry, your connection cut up. Was that meant for me?
Yes, Alan, that is meant for you. Should I take it again?
No, it's fine. I think I got the gist of the question. In terms of solidarity, for sure, if the moment that you were referring to with the criticism of the Tanzanian government of Citizen TV's reporting is anything to go by, then that's a clear example of where the media should circle the wagons and really try and stand up for one another. The point here being that this erosion has happened over time, and it's happened across the region. Some people used to joke that all of these presidents are in the same WhatsApp group and are just sharing the same forwards about how to do things. But the same should be said of the media, that we all need to have some basic tenets, some basic values that transcend competition, that transcend the fact that you're working in another media house, and allow you to focus on the larger goal, which is protecting this very important right that we have, because that right is exercised on behalf of the public. I think that's something that we tend to forget now and again. that the rights that we exercise are exercised on behalf of the public, and it's almost a public trust that's been placed in us, and therefore circling around one another and defending one another is not being defensive for being for its own sake. Rather, it is defending a right that the public needs access to. Right? There are a lot of progressive things in South Africa's constitution, which we borrowed heavily from, and even in the Tanzanian constitution and in Uganda's, that play to this, but it doesn't seem as if we're working on the same.
Right. And of course, looking at this, Fifi, in which way then do we stand in solidarity as media? Because I've seen in many cases, we've had situations where, let's say, a blogger has been arrested and, all TWIPs rallied on social media to actually push a hashtag and pushed for the release of this particular person in one or another. So in which other ways can media stand with each other on this continent, which remains still competitive as far as the sector is concerned?
Eugene, of course, standing together, a united front is always better and is always a stronger force in trying to enact change. And you are right, and I agree with my fellow panelists there that this is something that certainly needs to be done and done more frequently. In South Africa's case, I must say we are very, very fortunate because the media freedom or press freedom is something that is enshrined in our laws. It's something that came into effect in 1994 and still stands today. So even before, under the previous dispensation, where there were gross allegations of corruption, of looting, of malfeasance of the highest kind, where you had billions that were taken in taxpayers' money and put in the pockets of corrupt individuals, the media was allowed and still continued to tell those stories. And it is in that storytelling that eventually we did have an overthrow of the previous dispensation and a new dawn that it has been dubbed, although, it remains to be seen whether this is actually a new dawn or a continuation of the old dawn in some people's views. But I think that the easiest way and the strongest way for media to be able to go about doing its job, and that is telling stories without fear, without favor, and without bias, is being backed by a strong regulatory framework, which is something that we have here in South Africa. You cannot touch the media in terms of its freedom, but you can call the media to account when the media is wrong. There has been instances where stories have been fake. There's been cases where journalists in themselves have been influenced by other motives, be it money or politically. And there has been cases where those journalists have been dealt with. We've got a media regulator called a press ombudsman, whereby individuals who are not happy with certain storytelling because perhaps their side of the story wasn't represented, or perhaps there's inaccuracies in that story. There is a case where you as an individual can take the journalist on in a formal court structure to get a retraction or to get an apology. But I must say, I have, being a journalist that operates under complete freedom, what does help is knowing that the law backs you. And I do believe that this is something that perhaps this is definitely a conversation that we need to have as journalists on the continent, to advocate for media freedom on the continent where it currently doesn't exist.
Gadara, how did such a decision go through all the organizations or all the regulatory organs to the point at which this media house had to get to a point of doing what it was asked to do, only for people on social media to come and say, enough of this, why are we doing this? Why are we going through this? Tell me about this in line with what Fifi says as far as the importance of having strong regulatory frameworks to protect the media and also to safeguard the freedoms of other people.
Well, first we've got to understand this is a case of it's cross country, so it's government in Tanzania looking after a media house that's based in Nairobi, in Kenya. So the regulatory framework is not, we don't really have an international one. Everybody has, every country has its own framework. And I think that that's part of perhaps a problem. But I also am a bit, let's say, uncomfortable with the whole backing or idea of regulation, because lots of time regulation is understood to be restriction, so that it is about government telling you what you can and cannot do, rather than actually protecting or defending. And I think to a large extent, our institutions and our authorities think that their job is to control the press rather than to stand up for them, to control citizens rather than to stand up for them. So in this case, I would really have expected to see perhaps even the Kenyan government take it up with the Tanzanian government and to ask, why are you doing this to our media? And you don't see that happening, because again, the idea of regulation is again about restriction. It's not so much about openness. I think we have to sit back and think about the mechanisms that we have. I for one don't think that there's a problem with the media house itself. I think the fact that they were forced to apologize, and that they felt they had no recourse other than to do it, points out to the fact that they simply were left on their own. They were basically abandoned by their colleagues, or abandoned by the regulatory authorities, or abandoned by the government, And I think if we start thinking about that entire ecosystem and to ask, does it actually work to protect the rights of media practitioners, the rights of people, of citizens, and the ability to express those rights, or does it work to restrict it? I think we start having that discussion, then we can start seeing where we need to change. Like South Africa, we've got it in our constitution that, we are supposedly protected, the right to speak, to speech. But in practice, it doesn't always work out that way. And I find that we don't really have a discussion to ask, what do we need to change to ensure that the words in the Constitution are actually given life when it comes to cases such as this?
Right. Alan, in your perspective, all right, I'm told Alan is fixing the technical issue. Fifi, talk to me a bit about what you think on the fact that new media seems to be taking this space of what is termed as traditional media, mainstream media in many cases. We've seen cases of police brutality, and most of the time the mainstream media is always late to the party. Most people pick this from what a citizen journalist did record, posted it on their social media platforms. We download that, blast it, and put all our forms of our logos on it as if they were ours, and then we put it out there. I mean, explain to me what you think about this phenomenon and where we are heading as mainstream media.
Well, I'm personally very grateful for the citizen journalism. It has really made our lives a lot easier. In fact, as I was thinking about this question, I was thinking, in Africa, we hear the statistics to say that a lot more Africans have smartphones than they have bank accounts, right? And I suppose it does go without saying that there's a lot more smartphones on the continent than there are journalists, and then there are cameras or drones for newsrooms who can actually afford to use drone technology to get stories. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that there simply isn't enough resources, enough journalists for us to be everywhere at all times. And I look at new media and platforms like Twitter and Facebook and Google as more of a partnership. I mean, now you even have media houses who are competing against influencers who are starting their own news channels now and creating the exists on YouTube. So that's also another competition. But for me, I feel like the two go hand in hand, particularly when it comes to your citizen journalism, because, for instance, a picture of our health minister, let me bring it as an example. Actually, our communications minister, rather, a picture was taken of the communications minister having a meal at the house of a former deputy Minister of Education here in South Africa during lockdown. And this was clear evidence of the minister breaching lockdown rules. And this particular picture, it blew up on social media and it trended, and it was the news of the day because naturally we as media houses saw it's a minister in question breaking lockdown rules, and therefore there was extensive reporting. As a result of that, us as media houses, we were able to amplify the story that a minister in question had broken lockdown rules and what was government going to do about it.
Right.
Because we had seen government being tough on ordinary citizens and sometimes even arresting them who had broken lockdown rules. As a result of that amplification of a story from social media, the minister in question, our communications minister, was placed on 2 months special leave. She had to pay a fine, and therefore something was seen to be done. So my view on social media and new media is not necessarily that it is a threat completely, but there is a platform whereby we can work as partners. Look at what is trending on social media, where the interest is, where the need is, deploy our resources there as media houses when we can, or take a particular story of human interest, of relevance of social media, amplify it. And us as media, we are the ones who can speak with the decision makers, who can interrogate the stakeholders, who can get the change to happen as a result of what our citizens are showing us. So I think the two, as I just and repeat for the last time, should be viewed as a partnership.
They should be viewed as a partnership. Gadara, do you feel that mainstream media will lose its relevance, especially those of us who are on terrestrial, depending on terrestrial to push our content, our news? Because today something happens across the streets, especially let's look at even what is happening to our fellow Africans in China. This kind of videos, this kind of information has mostly been pushed on social media. And then the pressure that is being piled on governments is mostly coming from people on social media, not on mainstream media. Do you think this mainstream media is going to lose relevance in no time?
I don't think it's going to lose relevance. But I think the role that it plays is going to change, and I think that's where most of our media hasn't really figured out. It's still operating using a model that was developed for a very different time. So take a good example is breaking news. That is gone. As Fifi has explained, there are too many people walking around with camera phones, etc. They will always scoop the mainstream press. I think the only people in that regard who might be safe are people like John Allen. Because of the investigative reporting, which I think is going to take a while for social media to even try and do. But in the regular news reporting, I mean, that's going to go. You're not going to be getting scoops from there. But what it does, it actually focuses the media on what is what they can do best. And I think Fifi again hinted towards this, which is to explain the story, is to verify what is going on, is to do that which social media really cannot do, because we've got the resources to do it. So verification is one. And secondly, is to do what we used to call day 2 journalism, but you've got to be doing it on day 1. So that we are actually explaining from the get-go. You're not just reporting something that somebody saw, in the same manner that they saw it on Twitter. What would be the point? But infusing it with context, with background, helping the audience actually understand why this trending video on Twitter is important. And I think that is where we need to have gone to. But our media is still, at least as far as Kenya is concerned, is still lagging behind there. There is still the idea that is not stuff that they really need to do. And I think that's why over time they keep getting done in by social media, because they try to compete with social media on social media's terms, rather than to actually work to where their strengths are, which is explain, go out, put in the resources, put in the time, put in the research. That will then mean when somebody watches something, then they come out, they come from there knowing, understanding, rather than simply, it's another meme such as this on social media. One final thing that I will add is that for social media, I think that they are opening up a space for the mainstream, in the sense that they are pointing them to stories that they otherwise might not have followed. They're bringing out new avenues. And I think if mainstream media looks at it that way, they'll see the opportunities that are being created for them to do different and new things. I like what Fifi said about it being a partnership. I think there's a really huge scope for that to happen.
Right. And then, look, today many people have lost their jobs, and of course we've always had these words that the media is the voice of the voiceless. Some people call this cliche, but of course, do you feel, Fifi, that those who've lost their jobs because of coronavirus reasons, especially for employers who are actually invoking the name coronavirus as part of the reasons for these job cuts and salary cuts, do you think they feel let down by the media that did not pile pressure on legislators to actually, save jobs? Because I'm sure there is a way that, the legislators could have actually come up with laws or cushioning laws that would actually cushion both employer and employee, and probably would have saved more jobs. I mean, did we fail in that particular role? Would they look at us and say, you failed us because you did not push, you did not pile the pressure that was needed to save our jobs?
Sure. A tough question there, Eugene, and I wonder how much we could have done even if we had piled that pressure to save jobs. Because, I mean, if you read statistics, we would have all read what happened in the United States in the past 2 weeks, where 22 million people now have become unemployed. And this is a huge economy, an economy that was growing, I think, in the region of around 2%, which is great for a huge economy. And even that economy was caught off guard as a result of the coronavirus and the economic pressures that did result as a result of the lockdowns, and the loss of business activity did ultimately result in people losing jobs. I do think the state there tried their best to cushion the blow, which is what we have seen our governments also trying to do within their capacity, to cushion the blow of the economic hardships via, for instance, cutting interest rates, via a very number form of business initiatives, lowering taxes or deferrals of taxes or interest or payment holidays and the like. I don't know if we had the most pressure on our governments as to what they could have done differently to save jobs, if that would have been the case, because ultimately it goes back to the fact that this is a new experience for a lot of us. And perhaps in hindsight, when we look back, once the coronavirus has passed and we see the areas that we could have improved more, perhaps we can then be in a better position to answer the question as to have we failed the citizenry in not protecting their jobs by not applying pressure. But for now, Eugene, I think that in reporting the extent of the economic damage of the coronavirus, as well as, more importantly, the health implications of it, I really think our fellow colleagues on the continent are really doing their utmost best at this stage.
Right, so it's not time for us to feel sorry for ourselves or feel guilty. Alan Namo, I don't know what your take is, but also as you answer that, I would like to hear your take on this, because even the media has received a beating on this, because we've seen some media houses cutting down on salaries. We've seen others sending some of the employees on unpaid leave and all that, and we've seen media houses also calling on the government to actually waive certain costs of them, cost of electricity, cost of transmission of their signals. How then do we ensure that even as these stimulus packages are being said or given out to, let's say, the media, we are not forced or pushed in a situation where you cannot bite a finger that is feeding you?
Well, if just going back to the point that I was making about media generally being a public good, if you look at it from that point of view, any requests for help at this point in time would be requests made in the spirit of trying to ensure that a pillar of an important pillar of a democratic or progressive society is left intact or is helped to stand. So it's not so much that we are asking and pleading and our knees are supple. Yes, we are all being affected by all of this, but it is essentially the defense of a very important pillar for any progressive society to protect the media from collapse, or media houses generally from collapse. But like Fifi said, this is a very difficult situation, a very tricky situation that we're all in globally. I mean, South Africa's stimulus package of, what was it, 500 billion rand, which, if my maths is correct, is approaching the mid trillions in Kenya shillings, essentially was something that, yes, looked like a response that was equal to the task that South Africa is facing. But South Africa is also a much bigger economy than ours, and of course there will be some people who fall by the wayside. And that's the unfortunate thing about this. There'll be very many businesses that close down. There'll be very many people that will lose jobs. And the coronavirus will essentially leave our societies changed in a way that we have yet to come to reckon with. So I don't think that we should be in a position that we feel that we are weakened as a media by asking for this help. At any rate, this is help that everybody requires.
Right. Gadara, when we started this conversation, you'd actually mentioned that you are for this debate in the sense of the topic that the media in Africa is actually crippled, and part of the crippling has been in the essence of financial constraints. Now with COVID-19, the challenge must be a very difficult one compared to what it was before. How do we rescue the media? How do we make sure that, we still remain afloat and still perform our duties as required of us by the citizenry?
Okay, I'll make 2 quick points. First, on the issue that you had asked Fifi about, whether the media could have highlighted the job losses or push government, different things. I think for me, the important thing there would have been about mediating a debate, mediating a discussion, so that the media is not simply repeating what is being told elsewhere, but it's actually enabling citizens to participate in the decisions that are being made about whether they'll go to work, the effects of those, and that it's able to see what the options and different options are, so that when the policymakers make these decisions, they can then hold them to account for them, whether that was actually the best decision that could have been made at the time, with the information that we had.
Yeah.
So for me, it's really about figuring out how do we mediate that debate, rather than simply be watching it from the sidelines. With regard to the media itself, I completely agree with what John said about the media being a public good. I think we need to approach it that way. We've got to realize that the media industry has been in free fall, basically, for a very long time, across the world. It's not just an issue in Africa, And I think for societies, the question becomes, do we value media? And I think if we value it, then we've got to be willing to pay for it. And in the end, we can't get away from the discussion. And you're starting to hear it even now in the West about public support for media or the production of news, because this is a public good. And I distinguish public support from government. This is not something, it's not a favor that government is doing so that somehow then we become tied down to it. But it is a duty, actually, governments have that they should have. If you look at, for example, the construction of the Kenyan Constitution, it's interesting how we view the role of the government vis-a-vis the media. It's really about it being hands-off. How government is this threat to the media. But we don't impose on it. So in as much as we try and tell it to stay away, we don't impose on it a duty to support the press.
Yeah.
To support a free and open press. And I think that positive duty, we need to start thinking about how we can do that.
Right.
So for example, in the case of how they utilize advertising revenue, this government operates as if that is its own money. Yet it's all our money, And if we imposed a platform with it, that you've got to use this money to support independent media, you've got to use it in a way that is open and is accountable, so that it's not being used to buy support.
Yeah.
Then we could actually look at mechanisms for doing that.
Yeah.
And I think in the end, I just reiterate, we're not going to get away. I think the idea that news will pay for itself, that era is gone.
Yeah.
I think if we depend on simply hearing the news that people will pay for, we'll hear very little about what we really need to hear.
Right.
So as a public, we need to start thinking about how we need to support the production of news and how we will keep media institutions alive. And even within this case, not just talking about private media, we've got to start thinking about public broadcasters and public news organizations. I think we could look at the example of places like the UK with the BBC as models that we might consider about what we might do with our public broadcasters such as KBC in Kenya,
Sure.
To make them much stronger and to divorce them from the sort of control of government that they seem to live under today.
Right. We have about 4 minutes to go. I want to use these 4 minutes for us to actually give our parting remarks. And the question that I'll throw here is, first of all, Fifi, do you feel now that there are some, African governments that are going to be happy that finally, one of their pains is actually going to be suffering during this particular period, especially when it comes to financial flows, and that means weakening of the kind of stories that we are doing, how far we can go. Do you sense a feeling that this is what is going to happen? And how best then can we save the media in this case? If you were to be asked to decide on what to do so that the media can still remain afloat during these particular times and serve its purpose of passing the information and challenging power, what would you be suggesting? Briefly.
Eugene, I think I caught the tail end of your question there. There was an interruption with the connection. Mm-hmm. But if I'm understanding you correctly, and you're talking about how the media navigate platform in which it takes help or extra financial aid from governments, but still, continues to tell stories such that it is unbiased. My contribution would be, the thing is, governments want to be seen as credible and want to be seen as, transparent and accountable. And I believe that the best way for government to get that perception is to allow the media to do its jobs, and that is to tell a story, albeit good, albeit bad in the government's light, but allow the media to do the job. I always believe that, the great thing about being a financier of a certain platform is that you have got the opportunity to use that platform to get your side of the story told, perhaps an explanation. You've got that platform to perhaps apologize if it is you as a certain individual, as a government individual, as a party that has been found wanting. You've got that platform to be seen to be taking some form of account, either against yourself or the perpetrators. And what that translates is translates a message of credibility to you as the government, but also to the platform that you're giving money to. I mean, our viewers and our readers are not stupid. They're able to pick up on news organizations very quickly that tend to tell a biased story and a story in favor of the government. And what ends up happening is you lose your credibility, which is our currency in this game.
Yeah.
My fellow panelists were talking about the importance of quality, and people will be willing to pay for quality and that exclusivity. But quality, it ties so strongly, in my opinion, with credibility. And I think if both parties allow the respective sides to do their jobs and to do it as long as it's free and it's fair and it's unbiased reporting, even if the government does have to throw a lot more money our way in this time, we should still be able to continue in our role as media practitioners, because when COVID-19 lifts, once we pass this and we've done all we can and we've used all our resources to combat the health response that's needed right now, our economies are going to need growth. They're going to need investments, right? Mm-hmm. And everyone is going to want to tell that investment story. And what better way to aid an investment story than to be seen to be an economy that plays open cards. Right. I believe that surely capital will find it more welcoming in such an economy. So it serves government, even the private sector that sometimes funds media houses. It serves all parties to uphold credibility, in my view.
Right. Thank you very much for your view. Let's get to Alan. John, probably as you give us your closing remarks, I would love to understand from where you sit, how then do you continue doing what you're doing, with the limited resources right now, with the fear of actually getting the coronavirus because you don't know the territories that you need to go to. What sort of message would you be passing? Because people argue and say you cannot be able to tell these stories beyond these numbers that you're given, because number one, you have no access to these facilities, which people are now perceiving them as jail or torture places. Number two, you have no knowledge. Whatever you're told is actually what you should be able to take. And probably as you end, would you be able to tell us whether there is an exclusive cooking, maybe later 6 months down the line, on how the COVID-19 support, finances and everything and the handling was actually done in a good way from your investigative pieces?
Well, Eugene, I'll start with a second question.
Yes.
There's always something cooking in an investigative reporter's mind, so I just leave it at that. Mm-hmm. But with regard to how to tell these stories, these are the skills that I was referring to at the top of this discussion when we started. That all journalists, not just investigative journalists, but all journalists need to lean on at this time. A story or a journalist is not the source of the story. So to the extent that a journalist has to be there, especially in these times when there's limitations on movement and that sort of thing, is not exactly true. I mean, that's had to change within these past few weeks.
Right. We seem to have lost your signal. John, real quick to Gadara, what would be your parting remarks? What do we do here? How do we remain put as media to deliver on our responsibility even during these tough times? Do we sit back? Do we say, okay, even us, we're going to work from home and leave things to go on as they are, while probably bad things are happening now, even with people social distancing?
No, I think this is the time for media to shine, if you will. I think across the world, if there's one thing that this crisis has done, is to really show the value of the media, the value of getting accurate information out to the public, And I think it's really an opportunity for media to actually demonstrate to the public, that despite the hard times it's been going through, it still remains a real crucial part of a democracy. You really cannot simply rely on social media for your news. That you do need professionals going out there, getting verifiable information, feeding it, posing questions to policymakers, giving you the options that you have when it comes to government. So I think it is the opportunity for media right now to demonstrate what it's made of, but I think that comes also with sort of a warning sign. If they fluff this, then it's going to be much easier to dismiss them in coming times. And I think that would be a real shame, and it would be really disastrous for all our countries, for all our democracies, if it turns out that our media can't actually live up to its billing.
Perfect. Thank you very much, John Alan Namu in absentia, and of course Fifi Peters all the way in South Africa with CNBC Africa. Thank you so much for making time. Patrick Kadara, asante sana for making time and for your insights. All of you have been amazing, and of course we hope that we can push this to the next level, push the envelope even further, so that we can be able to implement some of these great ideas, or actually influence those who have to implement them from whatever spaces that they sit in. Thank you very much for being a part of the program. James Wanzala on Twitter. Thank you very much. James Wanzala says that the media, as any other industry, has and will be affected during and after COVID-19, and therefore there is need for all media owners to come up with strategies on how to come back to life and continue to be in business as social media takes over. Another one here is that all media need to go to the drawing board and look at how they can capitalize on social media by making it a source of news and create stories from them. These days, even trending hashtags can be converted into news stories, but some old school editors wouldn't hear that. These are very amazing comments coming through over here. One more from Alexander Kimani, who says African journalists are trying their best. Media in Africa is actually not crippled. Thank you very much for that particular tweet. And of course, for all of you who've been watching us from whichever parts of this particular continent and world you are, thank you very much for making time to be part of Africa 411. We'll be having more conversations on this and more next week, same time, same place. As always, my name is Eugene Anangwe, signing off.